Fantastic. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. And I'd like to welcome you all to this ninth installment of our WCRP ePESC webinars. They are part of the Explaining and Predicting Earth System Change Lighthouse activity of WCRP. My name is Leo Borchert. I'm from the University of Hamburg in Germany, and I have the pleasure to co-moderate such an event for the first time. So I'm really excited to be here. The webinar series is part, as I already said, of this WCRP Lighthouse activity on explaining and predicting Earth system change. And if you want to know more details about that, if you don't already know them, there will be a link in the chat that you can follow to read up on our activities and what we do. In today's webinar, we want to focus on characterizing observational uncertainties because that is always a topic that's really important to everything that we do in the climate community. So I'm personally really excited to see what we will learn today. For more housekeeping information and to introduce the first speaker, I'm now going to pass over to the other moderator today, Annalisa.
Thank you, Leonard, and also welcome all also from my side. I'm Annalisa Cherchi, and I'm from the National Research Council of Italy in Bologna. So we are going to introduce the speakers just before a few information on how this webinar is going to work. We will have all the three presenters presenting before the Q&A session that will be at the end. Anyway, anytime during the talks, you are free to post questions, and also please indicate to whom your question is directed to, and do it through the Q&A features that is at the bottom of the Zoom window. Also, everyone can upvote the questions that are already in the box, in the Q&A box. And please don't use the chat function for this question. Instead, keep the chat for technical issue in case there are any, and use the Q&A for question and answer. And so at the end, we will have the discussion. So just for the presenter, just a reminder that we will warn, you will have 20 minutes, so we will warn the first time 5 minutes before the end, and then 1 minute, when 1 minute is left, just for you to wrap up. And with that, I start presenting our first presenter, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lijing Cheng. He is a professor at the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He studies ocean changes under global warming, and he has published more than 130 papers now, with a total citation of more than 50,000. He received the Young Scientist Award from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the UNESCO AI Fuzan International Prize, and the Nicholas Fotonov Award from the AMS. He serves as co-chair of the International Quality Control Ocean Dataset Project. He is a member of the WCRP GCOS Schools Ocean Observation Physics and Climate Panel, and he is now coordinating lead author of the upcoming IPCC AR7. So thank you, Lijing, for your time, and now the floor is yours. Please share your screen. Okay, perfect.
Thanks, Annalisa and Leo, for the introduction. It's a really great opportunity for me to introduce our recent work on the uncertainty quantification for the ocean subsurface temperature and ocean heat content, because today's key topic is uncertainty. So I will introduce what is our current work on the uncertainty quantification. So the work is done by the members of my group. So the first author is Huifeng Yuan from my group. So we know uncertainty quantification is quite important. We need the uncertainty for all the observational estimates. So I try to highlight several key issues why we care about observational uncertainty. For example, the model. When you compare model with observations, you need to know how reliable the observation is, and also you need if you want to refine the global observation system, you need to know how uncertain, where the uncertainty is coming from for the current system, and also for the climate monitoring. So this figure gives you quite a simple example. If you compare all the up 2,000 meters ocean heat content, all the blue lines are different CMAP6 models, and the black lines is our observational estimate of ocean heat content time series. So you can imagine that case 1, if the uncertainty for the black line is case 1 that big, that means that models are really not bad, right? So it's within the observational uncertainty. But if you see it in case 2, if the observation is in a much narrower range, that means almost all the models are not good. The models are really bad. So the uncertainty really gives you different messages of how model works. So that is one example of why we need observational uncertainties. So what is the progress for now? So another example is I give you the current state of how people give the uncertainty estimate for the ocean heat content. So this figure, the left figure, shows you the up 700 meters ocean heat content time series. So you see that the time series are quite consistent, right? This shows quite a good upward trend since the late 1950s from different institute, different independent estimate. But if you look at their 90% confidence interval, the differences are huge. So they use different approaches to estimate uncertainty, and result in very, very different estimate for the uncertainty. So the current state, I would say, we don't know how much the uncertainty is, at least for ocean heat content and also subsurface temperature changes. So that is the current state. Very disappointing, but that is the case. So how people estimate uncertainty before? So I tried to list several approaches. For example, they use statistical methods based on the differences between observations and reconstructions to represent the uncertainty, which is purely statistical, and we don't know how good the fit is. So it's easy to have an overfit and get a quite small uncertainty. But that is the caveat of this method. Then second one, if people calculate trend, so obviously use OLS or some kind of weighted least square approaches. So that is also purely statistical method based on the features of time series, and does not account for the error sources in the data. So it's also suboptimal approaches, always relies on some statistical assumptions in the time series. So the third one is mainly using data assimilation approach. That is error propagation based on the instrumental error, representativeness error, and also based on the background information, that is prior. So this approach seems much more comprehensive, but they cannot account for all the error sources in the data. So there are also a caveat here. So the different also people people tend to use the differences among different products from different data centers. They provide different time series and use the differences to codify the uncertainty. So example is the IPCC AR6, that is ocean heat content time series. So they collect more than 10 time series from different groups and use some of them as a ensemble spread to represent the uncertainty. And for now, there are for IPCC AR6, there are more than 10 time series, but for now, there are more than 20 because now there are a lot of AI-based time series available. So the spread could be very huge if you really collect all the available data sets. So the assumption is really simple. So because if you use the assemble mean and also kind of assemble spread, you have to assume that all the time series are equal. So that is kind of a data democracy stuff. So people discuss a lot about model democracy, but for data, we also have data democracy issue. If all these data sets are equally well or not. That is a question, because always it's not, because some group are doing much better job than the others. Some methods are doing much better job than the others. So there are a lot of issues in the current estimate, what to do. So for me personally, I think it's really important to derive uncertainty estimate from the understanding of the error sources in the estimate. For example, for the ocean heat content and subsurface temperature, the uncertainty comes from how people do the quality control on the institute temperature data set, how people correct the biases in some instrument, for example, XBT, bottle, APB is marine mammal attached observations, and MBT mechanism, bathythermal graph. So there are biases here, and people use different methods to correct these biases that generate uncertainty. Also, the choice of climatology, because people use the anomaly field to do the mapping or spatial interpolation. So the choices of mapping, choices of climatology to derive the anomaly field is another error sources. And also how people do the vertical interpolation to standardize the vertical temperature profile. And also mapping instrumental error and representative error. So there are quite some error sources in the estimate. I think it's more than 10. So a reasonable estimate is, so because we cannot really mathematically formulate these error sources, so we think a good approach is to use several alternative approaches in each error sources, assuming that they are equally weighted. So you combine them all together to provide a large ensemble data set, so the ensemble members can represent the uncertainty. So we think this method can much comprehensively estimate the uncertainty in the data sets and provide a best estimate for our uncertainty. So that is what our group is doing in the past 2 years. So eventually we made 900 ensemble members. So for each different choices of techniques, and we selected different approaches and combine them. So 900 members are derived. So it's a huge amount of calculation. So the computer power is really important. So use a lot of CPU times and a lot of memories. But that is the best we can do, and we find that 900 members are sufficient for us to derive the uncertainty. So now you know our key ideas are. So in the following slides, I'm going to show you some results. First, the overall uncertainty that is represented, the shading in the left-hand figure show you the 5 to 95% quartile range for the uncertainty qualifications, and also the central estimate is presented. So you can see that really the uncertainty is really spread. The uncertainty is larger in the older periods, which makes sense because we have much less data in the past, and the data quality are not that good in the past. And but it's not asymmetric. So you can see that, for example, in 1970, so the error, so the uncertainty range is a little bit larger in the lower part than the upper part, because the distribution of the ensemble member, they are not Gaussian. So there are some kind of screwed distribution for the members, which is really interesting issue. That means different approaches gives different results. That is not Gaussian. So if you decouple all this total uncertainty to different error sources, you will see it in the right panel. So the total is in the black line, and so you can see that the major error sources for a long time is mapping. So that is how the spatial interpolation to interpolate the sparse ocean observations. So because in the past we don't have too much data, so the interpolation plays a really big role in dominating the uncertainty. So for the recent periods, it's really strange, because the quality control, you can see in the red line, dominate the error sources, That is also a very interesting issue, because that's related to how the quality control system deals with the warm extremes that are associated with warm eddies and in the west boundary currents and ACC regions. So because there are a lot of big numbers over there associated with realistic ocean signals, so some quality control systems are quite conservative they have removed a lot of this kind of realistic extremes, so generate quite big differences in the recent periods. So that is really interesting stuff. And besides of these two major error sources in different periods, you can see that vertical interpolation is quite important in the past, as shown in the light blue lines. So that's because a lot of data are not really in high resolution. Some of them are in 100 or 200 meters differences vertically. So the vertical interpolation plays quite important role in the past. But for now, it's okay, because we have a lot of high resolution data. So I will not go into the detail of this figure, but just give you some feeling of how the uncertainty differences for different error sources. So, and you can imagine that different error sources, they should not be independent, right? For example, the quality control, how many data you removed can impact the mapping method. So the different error sources, they should not be independent. So we try to calculate the covariances by using the difference between sum of the variance and the variance for the all assembled members. So it's more or less always negative, because the different error sources are always to ease the others' impacts. So that is the covariance aspect. So that is global mean. So if we go to the regional scales, you can expect that the different uncertainty should be different for different time periods, right? So in the older periods, for example, in the 1950s to 1964, the largest errors come from the Southern Ocean, because people observe the Northern Hemisphere more, because it relies on the human cruise lines and human activities. So it's more or less in the mostly in the Northern Hemisphere and in that period. And when the time goes more recent, so the uncertainty goes smaller, and we have more and more data in the Southern Hemisphere, so the uncertainty becomes smaller. So if you go to the recent decades, so you can see that the recent decades, the uncertainty has been much reduced compared with 60 years ago, but there are still quite some large uncertainty in the boundary current regions and ACC regions. So it makes sense, because there are much higher variabilities there, spatial and temporal. So you need more data to resolve this kind of variability. So the current observation systems still have issues in resolving this kind of eddy regions signals. And also you can break the total uncertainty in the current periods to different data error sources. For example, vertical interpolation, quality control, and mapping, and sampling issues. So it's really interesting that for the mapping and sampling, because mapping is to do the spatial interpolation, so it's deal with the sampling issue. So again, the boundary currents ACC region, Southern Hemisphere, shows quite a big uncertainty. But it's interesting that for the QC, it's a huge amount of uncertainty in the boundary current system. That the reason is, as I introduced before, is because how different quality control systems deal with extremes values in these regions. Because you can imagine that in the warm eddy regions, they associate with quite a big changes or much big anomalies in the thermocline regions. So small changes in the thermocline should associate with quite big temperature anomalies in these regions. So the implication is, if you want to improve the estimate
Lijing,
of
5 minutes left. Sorry.
Okay. If you want to improve the ocean heat content estimate, you have to improve all this kind of stuff, quality control, sampling, increase sampling, or increase vertical interpolation. So And just now, they are all results for the ocean heat content estimate, not for the trend. So for the trend, it's another issue. So we try to calculate the trend uncertainty for different time periods. You can see the bar plot, and decouple them to different error sources. And so I won't go into detail for that. But for the long-term trend, the mapping is still quite big error sources for the estimate. And the right-hand slide figure show you the first time derivative of ocean heat content. That is done biannually. So you can see the annual ocean heating rate uncertainty in the right hand side. So it's a pretty chaos figure because each year there are different dominant sources of errors. For example, this year is climatology. For now, it's mapping as climatology. So that means it's really systematical work should be done to really improve the ocean heat annual heating rate of ocean heat content, which is different from the annual estimate, as I showed before. So again, if you try to say the spatial pattern of the trend arrow, you can see that the recent decade, the trend arrow is still quite big in the Southern Ocean, in the boundary currents, in the Arctic regions. Because they are characterized by the high variabilities in this region, and the current, the Argo network is a dominant observation system in the ocean subsurface. The mean resolution of Argo network is 3 degree by 3 degree, so they are not really sufficient to resolve the boundary current regions and ACC regions. And go back to the model observation comparison. So I now add the uncertainty range for the observation. So you can more objectively compare observation with models. So the conclusion is only 7 models out of the 22 CMAP6 models fall into the observational range. So that means the models still have quite some issues in simulating ocean heating in the past. So that is for long term. If we go closely to the after 2005, that most recent decades, and here I compare the ocean heat content, the annual ocean heating rate in the red lines, and also add the blue lines for different ensemble members. So the blue range represents the uncertainty range, and also compare with the series date from top of atmospheric. So you can see that still the black line and the red line, they are not consistent, right, on interannual scale. So that means our current knowledge of ocean heat content still cannot explain why we have such big differences between the ocean heating rate and also top of atmospheric Earth energy imbalance. We expect they are consistent because more than 90% of heat goes into the ocean, right? So that is a puzzle for the community. But if you say the trend, so the trend of the time series, that is ocean warming acceleration and the EEI trend. So you say the trend is more or less consistent. The series trend is 0.5 watt per square meter per decade, and ocean heat
1
content
minute
estimate.
left.
Okay. Ocean heat content is 0.39, more or less consistent, more or less. So we have an acceleration of ocean warming and EEI. So another perspective to compare CMAP6 models, observational changes, and the TOA series state. So you can find that the series state is really falling outside of the observational range, and also CMAP6 models. Again, that is a puzzle for us because CMAP6 model cannot represent the series state, but our observations are quite consistent with CMAP. The final figures goes to, because I always use my data set IIP estimate, but if I compare all the available ocean heat content estimate in all these bars compared with the series data, you can find that all the data are smaller, shows smaller EEI trend than series. So that is a puzzle. So I think because I don't have time, so just use a half a minute to summarize. So observations is not perfect, so we need a certainty estimate. So we provide a larger sample approach to estimate the ocean heat content anomaly, and the larger sample could be a useful way to evaluate models. And the short implication for the dataset development is we should properly account for the error sources and provide a reasonable estimate of uncertainty and evaluate the datasets. So I also provided puzzles in the EEI because OHC and series data are really not a match for internal scale. So I will stop here. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lijing. This was really interesting, and I think it will provide quite a lot of material to discuss later on. So just as a reminder to the audience, if anybody has questions about that presentation, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or at least in my case, it's in the bottom of on the bottom of my screen. So I guess you will find it somewhere. Yeah, we will then take those questions into account in the discussion session after the last speaker. So please write up your questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, and I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Duo Chan. Duo is a lecturer in climate science and a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow in the School of Ocean and Earth Science at the University of Southampton. Before moving to the UK, he was a postdoc at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And before that, he had completed a PhD at Harvard University. Duo is interested in developing statistical and physical tools to quantify climate change and understand the underlying mechanisms. And he has crucially led the development of the dynamically consistent ensemble of temperature, DCENT, and I think we will hear some of that today. And he has published papers in numerous journals such as Nature, Nature Climate Change, Nature Food Science Advances, Journal of Climate, and others. His work has also been featured by New Scientist, NPR, Science, and other international media. So we're really interested to hear what he has to say about his work on uncertainty in observational data. And with that, Duo, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, Leo. Thanks so much for your introduction. Everyone, it's my great pleasure to be here. So can everyone see my slides all right? And can hear me all right? Okay.
Yes, it's good.
Great. Yes. All right. So so Lijing just gave us a very comprehensive and detailed uncertainty quantification of the ocean heat content. So in my talk, we're going to move from the ocean interior to the Earth's surface and talk about what we have been doing during the past 10 years about improving the quality of surface temperature data sets. So this work is in collaboration with people at NOC, Woods Hole, and Harvard University. So my talk will start from this figure that shows the global mean surface temperature anomalies relative to the 1850 to 1899 mean baseline from several major data providing institutes, including the Met Office, the US NOAA, NASA, and Berkeley Earth. As you can see, a common feature is that on top of the overall warming, there is a 4-stage decadal variability. And everything seems all right so far, and we know that 2024 was the first year that the annual mean temperature has exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. But all of these global mean surface temperature estimates actually consist of two components, the land and the ocean, that were measured by different people, stayed in different archives, and processed by different scientists. So if we break down these temperature estimates by land and ocean, we're getting this figure. So the yellow one is land and the blue one is ocean. And note that the two y-axes are on different scales. But nevertheless, we can find that after the 1946, the two seems to agree pretty well. But as we go back in time, mysteries arise at both global and regional scales. For example, during the World War II period, there was a warm anomaly by about 0.3 degrees Celsius, and that was only seen in the sea surface temperature estimates. And if we go further back, we find that during the early 20th century, the ocean actually warmed a bit faster than the land. And if we move further back, unfortunately, these two things show different trends at all. And mysteries also exist on regional scales. For example, this figure shows the regional average sea surface temperatures over the North Atlantic and North Pacific during the early 20th century. And you can see that the North Atlantic warmed by more than twice as fast as the North Pacific. So all these things are not reproducible by current state-of-the-art climate models, but they do constitute mysteries, and that might undermine our confidence of our understanding of how the climate system works and have evolved. So what we have been doing is that we start from the combined land-ocean surface temperatures and go backwards to improve the quality of the land-air surface temperature and the sea surface temperatures separately. And the first thing we do is we start from the raw land-air temperatures. And because these temperatures usually will contain change points or breakpoints that arises from, for example, changes in the instrumentation or the location of stations due to urbanization. So previously, people have been using pairwise homogenization algorithms to try to detect and remove these jumping points to back out the actual climate variabilities. And the most widely used algorithm was a pairwise homogenization algorithm developed by Meng et al. In 2009. So the rationale is that they will look at each station as the target station and try to compare with a bunch of neighboring stations. And by looking at the target neighbor difference series, they're going to detect abrupt changes in the difference series. And those will later be synthesized and attributed as breakpoints. This whole algorithm actually has been designed and written up and tested very carefully, but just with one limitation. That is, the threshold that they used to detect breakpoints was estimated from an assumption that the time series are white noise, or basically it does not contain any autocorrelation in time. However, we know that climate signals actually are autocorrelated in time, and this actually also applies to the difference series. So if we just look at the right-hand side figure here, which shows a synthetic data with an AR1 autocorrelation of 0.4, if we apply the original algorithm, actually the dashed blue lines are the detected breakpoints by the original algorithm. And as you can see, all these temporary up and downs will be treated as breakpoints. So in order to improve this algorithm, what we did is we try to use another approach called penalized likelihood. So this method allows us to treat and explicitly model autocorrelation using an AR1 process. And then the problem just becomes, can we find the best combination of breakpoints that best explains the data inside? And as you can see, once we apply the new algorithm, the blue lines are the detected breakpoints, and that aligns much better with the true breaks that we introduced in this time series. So basically improving the pairwise homogenization algorithm is the first thing that we did to better sort out the climate signals for the land surface temperatures. And similarly, biases also exist for the sea surface temperatures. And one of the best known bias was due to early sea surface temperatures being measured using buckets. And these buckets, as you can see, you need to haul water from the ocean surface and take measurements in wind on ship decks. So basically, these measurements can be biased by several tenths of a degree Celsius due to wind-induced evaporations. Obviously, existing datasets has accounted for these problems. For example, this is a map of estimated biases that has been used to correct temperatures in datasets, for example, like the HAD SST and Kobe SST. And the rationale is that they're going to use a fixed pattern to represent bucket bias, and this pattern has been derived physically from a bucket model. However, this essentially is basically saying that it's going to be the same person using the same bucket in the same way, but just taking measurements at different locations. However, the reality is always going to be more complicated because different types of bucket that contains different bias characteristics has been used by different nations following different protocols at different times over different regions of the ocean. So in order to better resolve these more refined bias structures, 5 years ago, or maybe now it's even 6 years ago, we developed a linear mix, an intercomparison method that groups measurements into different groups according to information, for example, like nations or the purpose of ships. And then when ships coming from two different groups come close to each other, we're going to pair them and use this pair to infer which group is relatively warmer or colder. And to get statistically rigorous estimates, we developed a linear mixed effect model to estimate for two things. The first is how each of the group, for example, the Japanese measurements, differs from the mean of all paired measurements, and also how these offsets across groups might have varied with region and time. So by applying this method to the actual observations that were thought to come from buckets, we actually find significant, highly significant offsets up to 1 degree Celsius across all these different groups. And remember, like all these groups were previously corrected in the same manner. And one of the most striking finding that we found using this method was a sudden drop in Japanese measurements compared with other nations by about 0.4 degrees Celsius in the 1930s. And later we found this document that supported our finding, because essentially these Japanese measurements were later digitized by the US Air Force. And during digitization, people just drop the decimal places. That basically means the numbers are truncated and are floored to the whole degree Celsius. So for example, 15.9 degrees Celsius will only be recorded as 15 degrees Celsius. So that no wonder gives you a code bias. But this also has important implications for the early 20th century mystery that we just saw, because now we need to account for this Japanese code truncation bias after the 1930s. And the truncation actually happened the Japanese measurements actually dominated the North Pacific. So after the adjustments, we can see that the two ocean basins actually warmed at a much more comparative rate, as opposed to having one basin differing by the other by 2 times. And another example that we can improve using this method is the World War II warm anomaly, because we can use this method to infer which group is indeed coming from bucket versus some other measurement types. And we also detected an interesting feature that the nighttime bucket measurements were anomalously warm during the war as opposed to the daytime measurements. And we believe that this also features unusual wartime measurement practices, that these bucket measurements were actually read inside doors where you have warmer room temperature and smaller wind. So that actually gives you a smaller code bias during the war as opposed to normal times outside the war. So if we fully account for all these biases, we can see that before correction, you have a large World War II warm anomaly, but after that, actually this anomaly is mostly gone. So our second improvement in the sea surface temperature estimate is really to apply these group-wise intercomparison to resolve more detailed bias structures. And for the last thing, we also try to check whether the land and the ocean temperatures are consistent or not. This can be done, for example, from a global view, where my colleague Sebastian Sippel has published this paper last year in Nature. So what we've been doing there is we try to develop a method to infer the global mean temperature from either only the land or the ocean temperatures. And as you can see in this figure here, basically the global mean temperature inferred from the land and ocean temperatures are just not consistent with each other. And this is actually quite similar to what we just saw at the very beginning. And interestingly, in 2023, we also published a paper that provides some local views. So in that paper, we just focused on the coastal area where the land and ocean temperatures meet along the coasts. And you would expect them to co-vary pretty well. But unfortunately, even if we look at the covarying temperatures along the coasts, you can see in this figure that these two temperatures are still not consistent with each other. So this actually, we believe that this inconsistency represents some undercorrected SST biases associated with a shift in the bucket types in the late 19th century. And specifically, it's a shift from using wooden buckets that are more insulated but less biased to canvas buckets that's less insulated but it's lighter, easier to use. However, it's also way more coldly biased. And we can actually have additional supports from the amplitude of diurnal cycles. So the rationale is like this, right? So if you're using a less insulated bucket, it will experience more cold bias due to wind during both day and night. But at the same time, it will also experience more solar heating during the day. So that will give you on average a colder bias, but at the same time, a bigger diurnal cycle. So in this figure here, I'm showing the changes in the amplitude of diurnal cycle in the tropics. So this is shown in the orange curve. As you can see that basically the diurnal cycle increased rapidly in the late 19th century. It plateaued throughout the early 20th century and then dropped suddenly in the World War II period. And that drop is associated with, during the wars, the large engine ships were using another method to take water temperature at a much deeper depth to represent SST. So that is expected. But this rapid increase in the late 19th century and then plateaued during the early 20th century behavior is actually an indication that maybe this transition from wooden to canvas bucket has finished or completed earlier than what we have expected. And if we plot the bias adjustments of these different different SST estimates on top of each other, we can see that for the red one, which is the adjustment that is required to bring SST measurements into consistency with land temperature estimates, it also increased rapidly in the late 19th century and plateaued throughout the early 20th century. And another support is from comparison with the coral-based proxies. So you can see
5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, no worries. We also find like these coral sites using the data 018 or the strontium calcium ratio to indicate temperatures. So the coral indicated temperatures are shown in the black and gray like shadings. And we also compare different estimates. So for the red one is the one that brings SST into consistency with the land temperatures. And you can see that this one actually agrees better with the coral-based proxy records, which do not suggest a cooling in the late 19th century. Whereas if you look at other estimates, they all show like a significant cooling during the late 19th century. So that is why we kind of like our third improvement is to basically intercompare the land and the ocean temperatures and try to homogenize the two. And we decided to correct the sea surface temperatures against the land temperatures. And obviously, we have also tracked the uncertainties along the entire process that we did. And this gives us a new ensemble of surface temperature estimates that we call the dynamically consistent ensemble of temperature, or DECENT. So what does DECENT say about the global mean surface temperature estimates? Well, rather than having a 3-stage decadal variability, the 4-stage decadal variability, DECENT actually suggests a smoother warming with only 3 stages. But because we adjusted the baseline temperature a little bit down by 0.1 degrees Celsius, so the overall warming from pre-industrial period is about 10% faster than existing estimates. So I'm going to skip this line. And also, recently we have just published we have like in-field DECENT to have global coverage, and the paper is recently accepted by the Geoscience Data Journal, so it will come out next year very soon. And actually everything or a lot of the bias adjustments that I've been talking about today has also been picked up by the latest release of many other data sets. For example, had SST 4.2 and Kobe SST3. So in this figure here, I'm basically summarizing the state of the art of different SST products for several features that we saw at the very beginning. For example, panel D here is the early 20th century warming anomaly for the two axes indicating the North Atlantic and North Pacific trend. And what is interesting is that previously, for the early versions of sea surface temperatures, those are basically in the open like circles and markers. They all sit outside the range that can be expected from the CMIP6 models. But if you look at the more updated versions, including the HAT SST 2.4 and Kobe SST3, actually these things become more consistent with the CMIP6 estimates that the two ocean basins warm at much more comparative rates. Similarly, for the World War II warm anomaly in panel B, we actually see that previously a lot of these things were just outside the range of whatever the models can reproduce. But if you better account for data biases in all these more recently released SST products, they actually give you a much more reasonable estimates. So you might also be wondering, what does this mean for my study? Well, I want to talk about two case studies here. One is about the satellite era warming. You might think, well, this is a well-observed period, so maybe, the SSTs are actually agreeing pretty well with each other.
One more minute.
Yes, sounds good. Yeah, thank you. And we have this Nature Climate Change paper pointing out that if you look at different versions of SST product, they actually differ even in the satellite warming in the satellite area. However, these studies used outdated product estimates. And in this figure I'm showing here, as you can see, I highlight the range for the most updated estimates. And you can see that actually this gives you a much tighter range. That is not what this Nature Climate Change paper was referring to. And similarly, there is this other paper that just came out 2 days ago talking about the tropical Pacific temperature gradient. And a similar conclusion applies here. The better, more recently released products actually does a better job. So right now we're leading a SST community initiative to basically put together a guidance for you to how to choose SST datasets suitable for your research. And specifically, we developed the tool on the left-hand side that allows you to quickly visualize and summarize everything we know about the current versions of SSTs. And we also provide the guidance on the NCAR Climate Data Guide page. So these things will be updated. So hopefully, whenever in the future you need to use SST data products, refer to these pages and find the thing that best suits your needs. So I'm just going to stop here, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Duo, and thank you for your presentation. Very interesting and very full of information. So if you have questions for Duo, please write down in the Q&A box, and as we will read at the end. Okay, now let's move to our last speaker for today. And welcome, Stephanie, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Fiedler. Stephanie is full professor in experimental physics and co-director of the Institute of Experimental Physics at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And she has a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Leeds in UK. She had professorship of maritime meteorology at Kiel University in the past, and for the energy meteorology at the University of Cologne. Her research interests include the interaction of atmospheric composition and dynamics, including the role of aerosol. That is the topic of our talk today. So, Stephanie, now the floor is yours, and we are hearing you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about aerosols. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'm going to start with the motivation. Why do we actually care? What we see here is a time series over the historical period for the effective radiative forcing and shortwave at the top of the atmosphere. The gray line shows all anthropogenic changes taken together, and the yellow lines is for anthropogenic aerosols only. Now, what we can see right away is that there's quite a bit of spread across of the different CMIP models. So these are here the small individual lines, and the means are quite informative in terms of what has happened, which also ties in with the previous talk, which is nice to see. So what do we see? From the 70s onwards, the aerosol in a global perspective didn't really change drastically, which means that also the effective radiative forcing stayed more or less similar. And we only saw since the 2000s or so a weekly positive trend, which means that the aerosol forcing became weaker to some degree. This implies that this sharp increase that we see for the anthropogenic ERF is primarily explained by the greenhouse gases. And even more interestingly, compared to the time series for temperatures that we've seen in the previous talk, is that the anthropogenic aerosol forcing strongly increased in magnitude between the 30s and the 70s or so, which muted the increase in anthropogenic ERF during that time period. So there's a link to the temperature that we've seen previously. Now, measuring anthropogenic aerosols is difficult. We can measure the total aerosol optical properties, like for instance, the aerosol optical depth, which gives us an idea about the aerosol scattering and absorption, so the extinction, both taken together over the entire vertical column of our atmosphere. When we look into satellite data, which is here in the center of this figure, we do have quite a bit of a spread. So we're talking here about something in between 0.14 and 0.16. And even the reanalysis products, which are shown here in color, are again showing different results for the global total aerosol optical depth. In comparison to CMIP 5 and CMIP 6, this range across the different observational data sets are smaller compared, for instance, to CMIP 6 and to AeroCom 3, which are the latest model comparison projects for aerosol and climate. In comparison to the earlier phases for both of these data sets, so when we maybe focus on CMIP 6, we see that in CMIP 6, we really see a higher global mean AOD compared to CMIP 5, and that is more at the upper end of the range of observations. Now, when we look at the regional distribution, we see from the CMIP 6 models that it is not equally distributed, where the CMIP 6 models are diverging the most. And also the satellite products are not equally well across all regions. This is here from a study by Annika, a postdoc of mine from the University of Cologne. And we really saw that in many places, the range across the CMIP 6 models is much larger compared to satellite products for the total aerosol optical depth. We can compute the multimodal mean like we often do in CMIP 6 and then compare to the satellite mean to identify where the largest biases are. And I just want to point out two specific features here in these figures, which are North Africa, where we do have desert dust aerosols. We have a large bias there with almost a dipole pattern, with a strong overestimation towards the east and underestimation towards the west. At the same time, we have a large range from the CMIP 6 models on the left-hand side, and also the range from satellite products indicate that there's quite some observational uncertainty. The other region that I would like to point out here is the Southern Ocean, where the range across the CMIP 6 models for AOD is fairly large as well. And also the bias here compared to the satellite mean is not to be underestimated, at least. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that we do also have to look into nature aerosols, even though we often focus on anthropogenic aerosols. Now, how can we make progress? In terms of anthropogenic aerosols, there is the typical understanding that we would run a global climate model and estimate how a perturbation would change the climate simulated in that model. One way to do this is to prescribe aerosols, for instance, for anthropogenic aerosols, as will be done in CMIP 7. And one way to do this is to use a simplified approach, which is computationally fast and allows us to sample different states. So for instance, across the different uncertainty estimates that we might have from satellite products. There's a parameterization for doing this. This is simple plumes. Simple plumes is called simple plumes because we're using mathematical functions to approximate the spatial and temporal evolution of the aerosol optical depths for the anthropogenic aerosols. In this case, in the horizontal, we use Gaussian functions. In the vertical, Bader functions, and the seasonal and also the year-to-year changes are scaled over time, which means that we can really tie to the estimated emissions how much aerosol has actually been in the atmosphere from the past to the present and also into the future. Now, this comes as a Fortran package and can be implemented in climate models. Originally, it was thought in 2015 to use it in the radiative forcing model intercomparison project, but then also got to become a standard in some of the global climate models and has been tested in regional climate models by 2019 or so. And since then, it really has developed quite a bit further. So there were other model intercomparison projects using the simple plume approach. There have been satellite retrievals for radiation fluxes using the aerosol that has been produced by this parameterization. And there are now more requests from CMIP7 and from climate predictions to actually produce new data sets for simple plumes, which is now in the making. Now, additionally, what my team is currently developing are plumes for desert dust and for sea spray, because these are the two ones which are very important. And as I will show at the very last slide of today, especially desert dust with the historical trends is really quite a hard problem to get right in our models. Let me start off with showing how simple plumes is actually performing compared to the observational estimates that we have. All of the data sets listed on the right are satellite products and reanalysis data sets. So observational products here shown from 1995 to 2020 or so, depending on when they have ended. At the top is CMIP6 in purple, CMIP5 in the other purple in the center, and simple plumes in the orange. So simple plumes really falls within the observational range. And I would like to point out here the scenarios from 2014 onwards, because this data set here is still based on CMIP6 emissions, and point out here the difference that the COVID pandemic had. So during that time, we remember it all, we more or less stayed at home. So there were less emissions also for aerosols and their precursors. And we estimated how strong this influence was for the global aerosol URF, and it turned out to be comparably small. What we were interested in, because most of our data sets end in 2014 and are typically not annually updated, is to understand how well our original scenarios would actually be able to cover unexpected trends like COVID. So we looked into the trend from 2010 to 2022 for the aerosol optical depths in the center from the satellite observations that we had at the time, with a clear decrease, especially over Asia. And we compared from the COVID MIP scenarios, where we had a rough idea what the pattern should look like, with a spatial correlation of 0.7, fairly similar to what the observations told us. And the best CMIP6 model is here shown on the right. And again, it is also not that far off. So we still have an underestimation over East Asia, although it is not quite as strong, but at least the pattern is somewhat represented in the existing data sets. So what one could imagine is to use these patterns and then experiment with them, even if emission data sets are not yet available, because satellite data would typically come in relatively faster. We did produce the anthropogenic aerosol development from the new CMIP7 emission data sets. This is here shown on the left-hand side for the year 2014 for comparison reasons. It was the last year available from CMIP6. Again, over East Asia, as one would expect, is still the largest aerosol optical depth from anthropogenic sources, but it's lower compared to CMIP6, indicated here by the blue color in the center. If you have used CMIP6 plus in between, so if you have used that in your model, then it's not that different compared to CMIP7, at least for 2014. We have analyzed how this has an influence on the effective radiative forcing in a model which is fairly new to CMIPs. It's called ICAN-XPP. On the left-hand side, we use the aerosol data set from consistent with CMIP7 emissions, in the center with CMIP6, and on the right-hand side also from CMIP6. The only difference between the center and the right-hand side figure is which climate state we're calculating the effective radiative forcing in. Now, consistently with where the most aerosol aerosol sits, we have the strongest forcing over East Asia. The largest regional contributions are from these regions. In the global mean, it's about minus 0.3, independent of whether you use CMIP7 or CMIP6. So it's fairly similar. The people amongst you who know forcing probably notice that it's not very strong in comparison to other estimates, which might rather be due to the new model instead of the simple plume data itself. So in other models, we can actually induce much stronger radiative effects with simple plumes. Now, the historical development for the AOD reproduced by simple plumes indicates that compared to CMIP6, CMIP7 is fairly similar, although not identical. When we look, for instance, on the bottom left to Central Africa, there's quite a difference around the 70s. And of course, East Asia stands out here because the forcing extension really indicates that there's a drastic decrease in the aerosol optical depth from anthropogenic sources. Another way to approach uncertainty is to do classical climate model intercomparisons, and that's something that we currently plan in the community for aerosol and chemistry. We call it AirChemIP Phase 2. And these models really are difficult to run in the sense that we really have a very high model complexity. At the same time, we would like to have a very high model resolution and as many simulations as possible in order to also represent the internal variability. Now, keeping all of that in mind is, of course, reaching a computational burden for the modeling centers and really a boundary at some point. So we had to make choices what we would want to address. And in AirChemIP 2, it's really about looking into the complex Earth system models that we have and trying to increase the number of simulations as much as we possibly can. Now, we're requesting these experiments. There are quite a number of them, but additionally, we also asked that few experiments are going to be done by kilometer scale models just for aerosols. So it would sit at a lower model complexity in this little graphic here, but we would have a very high model resolution to have a consistent approach how we phrase the experiment to have a comparability. Now, the Tier 1 experiments in AirChemIP 2 will really be part of the assessment fast track. And there are 3 experiment groups that we identified to have in there. The first one is the radiative forcing component, such that we can, again, produce and inform produce graphics like these to inform policymakers to really pinpoint where the forcing quantities come from. We would want to have, again, future scenarios, which are very different in CMIP7 compared to CMIP6. And we want to have historical experiments, again, for attributions. So these are the things that we're requesting here. But we're not stopping there. There are also a few other things that we want to do. Many models have already said that they would want to contribute. There's quite a bit of coordination going on with their AFMIP, the detection and attribution MIP and scenario MIP, of course. And there are some experiments that want to really address knowledge gaps that we have. And one interesting knowledge gap, I can't really focus on all of them here in this talk today, but one interesting one is the puzzle that we have in our climate models for the historical development of desert dust. What you see here is work done by Jasper Koch and Danny Lijing. They have identified that from 1815 to 2014, the historical simulations don't really capture the observed reconstruction, the observed trend, so the reconstruction of desert dust across this time period, which is shown in black. But they came up with an experiment with CESM2 where they prescribed this reconstruction and then really were able to reproduce at least the dust aerosol optical depths here in this particular case. Now in AirChemIP 2, we are requesting such experiments from more models to identify what the influence of desert dust on the historical development on climate is. And we are producing the plume approach for this purpose as well. So if you are not willing to, for instance, run your full complexity emission and concentration capability for these sort of experiments, we would be able to provide a very efficient way to, again, have an experiment to capture desert dust trends over the period. That's work that is done currently in my team. And if you are interested, feel free to reach out or read a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. And also thanks for perfect timekeeping. Lisa didn't even have to, so, I mean, more than perfect timekeeping. Very nice. I think your talk complemented really nicely the previous presentations in that you leaned a little bit more on models. And I think that's also an important discussion maybe to be had right now in the discussion section. But before we do that, let's really thank the three speakers for now and start taking questions. And while all of you come up with good questions to everybody and keep putting them in the Q&A thing, let me maybe kick this off by asking a question to all three of you, which I guess has different flavors for each of you, but that's also what makes it interesting. Where do you see the most important future perspectives in what you're doing? So in the context of quantifying observational uncertainties, but maybe also for at least Lijing and Du, who talked about reduced observational uncertainties. I'm not entirely sure if that works for you, Stephanie, as well, but if it does, please also feel free to answer on reducing observational uncertainties in the future. Because I think we heard a lot about comparisons to past past observations and reduction of uncertainties there, but I'm wondering a little bit, how does that project into the future, and how should we design our observation systems maybe to not fall into these pitfalls as we did in the past? We could just go through, if nobody jumps on this right away, we could just go through in the way that you spoke, and since Lijing got the longest break, maybe you can give the first response.
Thanks. So actually, we learned a lot from the past. So a lot of lessons learned. So I think for the future, the first one is we need a good, better instrument. So you can see, if you look into the past, a lot of instruments are really not that advanced, because we can understand that because of the technical disadvantages in the past. But we need a better sensor and a better calibration on the sensors. So I think that is the first thing. The second thing is we do really need metadata. So how you including all the instrumental informations, also include how you deploy the instrument, and also how you process the data. All this kind of information, we need to document that, and just in case in the future that we identify something that we need to resolve. Because in the most difficult, I think Dortan also maybe share my opinion that a lot of difficulties comes from we don't have really metadata information for the old data. That generates a lot of problems. So we need to preserve that. So I think that is what I want to share for now.
Thanks, Lijing. Du, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I do have several points to add on to Lijing's answer. So the first thing I believe is we need to have even better coverage. So even if like these days we say we have like so-called global coverage, but if you look at the in situ measurements, the polar regions are still like very sparsely directly sampled. This is not only for the Antarctic, but also for the Arctic. So that is definitely something that we need to improve. And at the same time, the documentation of like our data sets also needs to be improved, right? Because we might thought that, well, during this recent period, we have better instruments that are more dedicated to do what people want them to do. But at the same time, the data providers might be applying some like choice specific treatment to these to their data sets. And one example was the OISST version 2. That seems to be an outlier, right, in the figure that I showed about the recent satellite era warming. And it was only after we kind of like collaborated with the NOAA team and dug into the details that we understand, they actually applied a constant adjustments to the ship-based measurements until now, but that does not seem to be quite necessary. And that might be a reason why you see an overestimate of the trend compared with other data estimates. And the last thing I wanted to say is kind of like related to the metadata that Lijing has mentioned, is that we need to keep a good record of what data are measured and how they are measured. Because I'm pretty sure like a century ago, people will never realize the temperature measurements they collected will be used to study climate change, a century later. And I do believe like this saying will be applicable to our situation at the moment. We probably won't know what people will be using or how people will be using our data sets. And so basically a good keeping of metadata becomes especially important in the case that the data set are used outside their historical scope, outside what they were measured for. Yeah.
Thank you. Stephanie, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, these were all very good points already. So of course, we really need measurements in remote regions. The oceans are particularly important, and I pointed out for also that we do need measurements in the Southern Ocean in particular, where the satellite and the model observation range, the model and observational range is actually quite large. But it's not the only region. So I think we also need to go to deserts. Yeah, when we think of land, nobody's living there to take ground-based measurements, or at least very few people do, and we need to improve on that as well. Another thought that I would want to add is that we really have the opportunity to represent uncertainty from observations in the models themselves through perturbation experiments. So that's one thing that we could do in the future, because we will never entirely rule out that there's observation uncertainty. It will persist even if we are doing our very best to get rid of the errors. But I think we could do much better in a community sense in actually representing and acknowledging that there's actually quite a bit of uncertainty, especially when we go further towards the past.
Thank you. So there were a few questions on the Q&A box, and there was one for Lijing, and he actually already answered, so you can see and read it. And I see now there are a couple of for Duo. So one from Eric Fisher, and he's asking, he said amazing work. And before AR6, there was a lot of discussion around blending and its effect on trends. For example, difference between trend in SST and 2-meter Earth temperature above the ocean. What is the current understanding on this? And has this turned out to be a second or third order problem compared to the one you identified?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So in my view, right, the differences between how you blend components together and how you compare data and model is really just pointing to the importance of like we need to make apple-to-apple comparisons, right? So in that sense, like if we mask out the temperature, the TAS over the ocean in the models and replace that with TOS, then that means the two are probably more or less directly comparable with each other. And I think the bottom line from my research is more about, when model and data disagree, it's not always the models are wrong. In addition to like whether you're comparing apples to oranges, another thing is that the apple that you're using might not be a reliable apple. So that is something also you need to keep in mind. And I also have some information on like using this air temperatures about the ocean, so the marine air temperatures. So there was a project called GLOWSAT, led by Dr. Elizabeth Kent at the National Oceanography Center. And what they aim to do is to better correct the marine air temperature measurements such that you can get an estimate that's purely air temperature for both the land and the ocean. And that probably will make the comparison with models easier. So their data paper has just been published, I think, recently. But again, like these marine air temperature measurements are not bias-free. For example, like as your ship gets bigger and bigger or taller and taller, the location where your sensor sits actually also increases. So that will give you a code bias. And that thing is actually ship specific. And at the same time, previously, like in the late 19th century, a lot of the ships were like coal engined, and later they were shifted to the oil engined. And unfortunately, different types of ships also release different deck heat, and that also has an impact on like your air temperature measurements. And there is additional like solar heating that will bias your deck temperatures. So I believe like all these things needs to be very carefully accounted for before we can fully rely on the marine air temperatures to replace sea surface temperatures. So far, I think we should look at both of them, understand the problems, and make a sensible comparison.
Thank you. Yeah, I think
Do I answer
that
the question? Yeah.
I mean, Eric can ask again, I guess, if he wasn't happy. I think it was very helpful and addressed the question. There's another question to do from Kirsten Findel, and that's asking you to speak more about the diurnal cycle. So how do you take into account the measurement time of day, and does descent include sub-daily estimates?
Right. So these are like two separate estimates. The first thing is descent is monthly estimates. It doesn't provide you like a day-to-day, no, sorry, hour-to-hour like resolution. So what we did to the diurnal cycle is that we keep track for each one of the ships. And fortunately, most of the ships record a time, either like UTC or local hour. Well, obviously, like back in the days, they were mostly like local times. So we basically can use the ship tracks and the local time or local hour information to back out what is the day-by-day variability and within day variability for each ship on each day. And we use that to back out the diurnal cycle information. But that information, we try to make it like relatively independent to the final product. So yeah, so basically descent is a monthly product and this diurnal cycle uses hourly information, but it's an independent estimate.
Thank you, Du. There is also another question, the Q&A for Stephanie this time is from Eric Fisher. So since CMIP6 historical run stopped in 2014, some people just added the first years of the SSP driven runs to compare trends in models and observation, for example, up to 2024. How much of was the observed AOD evolution from, for example, the SSP 7.0 from 2015, 2024? He says also, I would expect the differences in regional trends over East Asia may be substantial.
Yeah, it's a very important question. So especially over East Asia, we saw the largest differences compared to CMIP6 over the past few years. I don't know the exact number from that specific scenario, but when I look into how we are reproducing from the historical to our for the historical period from CMIP6 and CMIP7 emissions, what we get, we come over East Asia about half as much AOD compared to 2010. So it's actually quite a big reduction in terms of how much aerosol sits over this area. So I would assume that there is quite a bit of a different response, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And there are no more questions in the chat, but just take advantage of my position. And I have a question for actually the three of you, starting from Lijing, because he mentioned this. So he mentioned the AI-based estimate or the using of that. So the question for all of you is, how do you see advantages or disadvantages or non-advantages in this new type of data, new type of methodology based on AI on this topic of reducing uncertainties in the observation? Lijing and then.
So this is a quite an important one because now we have a more and more AI-based approach. I would say that AI provide quite a convenient tool to develop a data set. So that's why you see a lot of data sets available. But I find that most of data sets are not convincing to me because there lack of evaluation, because the AI is quite a black box. You don't understand how it works mostly. That means the evaluation is really important. How the AI approach merge the data and provide, if they provide physically tenable signals or variabilities or changes consistent with our physical understanding. This kind of evaluation is critical, very critical for the AI-based approaches, which I think mostly they are missing. So I would really that's quite aggressive, but I would say for the future we really need a good evaluation on the AI-based approach before we can truly use it. So that is my perspective. Yes.
All right, yeah. So to add on Lijing's comments on the evaluation, that is indeed something quite lacking at this point. And my view on AI is also not as optimistic as many others, because I do believe like there are things that AI can do and cannot do, and really depends on how much data do we have to train these models. For example, like when it comes to the bias corrections, we actually do not have that many data to tell like AI what is good and what is bad. And obviously, like AI probably won't be able to dug into the how Japanese measurements were digitized and that sort of things. So in terms of those, I would say the domain knowledge from human experts still remain quite important. But at the same time, I do find there are cases where AI can be quite helpful. For example, like when it comes to spatial infilling, that we have a lot of physically constrained model simulations. If we assume the models are correct, well, that's definitely a bold assumption, and that is the thing that needs to be evaluated definitely before training the AI models. But given a large amount of data available there, right? So I believe like AI can be quite helpful in terms of like improving those methods, because right now a lot of the infilling methods relies on like 40-ish years of satellite measurements and EOF modes. And we are not sure whether they're stationary, whether you observe one or two ENSO events. Is that the pattern that's representative for everything we have had in the past 200 years? Those are the open questions. And I believe with careful evaluations, AI can be quite helpful in those areas.
Yeah, I can only reiterate, I guess, on these two important points. So it's very essential to have a human assessment of what an AI is giving us, but it's a very essential tool in many ways because infilling, which has just been mentioned, really gives us new opportunities that we simply didn't have before at the same computational cost, let's put it that way. So I think it's powerful and it should be viewed critical, like with everything that we do in science. But I think we shouldn't discard it because we are somewhat too skeptical. Yeah, so a middle way, I think, is something that we should take.
Thanks a lot. Since there are still no other questions in the Q&A, I'm going to also take my privilege and ask a question to all of you, and maybe we can have this as a sort of a final thing unless something else comes up. And it's less of a question than it is a request, I guess. And let's go the other way around this time. So start with Stephanie. What, in very brief, what would you want everybody to take away from this session today? What is the one thing that you would like people to remember?
Do I have many words?
I mean, as long as you don't make it a German sentence, I think it's probably fine.
Yeah, so I think the essential takeaway message is try to use as many lines of evidence as you can and do consider not only model uncertainty, but also observation uncertainty. I think we often take observations as granted as the ground truth. And I think in many ways, this is also very important, but it's not that they are perfect.
Right. So I'm going to recycle something from my answers. So it is important to make apple to apple comparisons, and it is important to make sure that both apples are good ones and reliable ones. And finally, more recently released apples are more likely to be better apples.
So Stephanie just said what I want to say. So I would like to say something else. So for me, I think it's really important to give credit to the people who are working on observation side to understand the biases or quality control, all this kind of very technical and very hard, maybe very tough work. It's time consuming and labor intensive, and including what the door is doing. But this community is shrinking now because of the AI, because of other, fancy fancy topics. But I think it's really important because if you want to use AI, you need to have reliable data to learn with, right? So that's quite a fundamental work to do. So I would like to speak for this community to get more credit for the fundamental data developments. That's it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all three of you. And now that we only have 5 minutes left, let's really thank the three speakers again. Give them a round of applause, Lijing, Du, and Stephanie. Thanks so much for your really, really nice presentations and the excellent Q&A session that we had afterwards, answering all of our questions. That was really, really interesting. And also many thanks to all of you still online for your attention and participation today, and also for contributing to the discussion section. I thought this was really, really fun and interesting. Just to reiterate, or I don't think we actually said that before, but we intend to have these webinars about every 2 months. And that means that we plan to have the next event in January or February. And we're currently finalizing discussions about the specific topics, but it's probably going to be related to reanalysis products. So we're going to go stay in a similar topic, but it's going to be quite different in focus. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again to the speakers, and thank you to Leonard, and also to the WMO staff that hosted us and allow us to have this webinar. And let's see you at the next webinar, and enjoy your day or whatever time of the day it is for you.